Thank you,
Thank you.
Amanda. And great to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And bon appetit, everyone. While a lot of the focus has been so far focused on carbon and net zero, today I want to talk about the invisible and silent, but highly related crisis of the loss of biodiversity. So I'm just trying to share my screen. Is everyone able to see my slides now? I'm not sure if this is working. Give me one moment. Okay, I think that should be up now. Wonderful. So what you're about to hear is not a pretty picture, but it's essential if we're going to achieve our climate mitigation and adaptation goals. So many of you may know that we depend on nature for everything, and it's been declining at an unprecedented rate. About 50% of all GDP is highly dependent on nature. Pretty much everyone and everything depends on it to varying degrees. And despite these critical interdependencies, rather than protecting nature, we've been relentlessly exploiting and destroying it, taking its permanence for granted and forgetting it's just another resource which is becoming scarcer and scarcer by the day. And the declines you're seeing here has not really happened over centuries, but really the bulk has happened in the last 40 or 50 years. And scientists at the Natural History Museum in London, which we work very closely with, will tell you that extinction is happening at 100 times faster than the natural evolution rate, which means that where it used to take 1,000 years for a species to go extinct, it's now been reduced to nearly 10 years. And so here's another alarming statistic, and I'm very sorry that you're all eating now, but if we killed each other at the same rate that we kill other animals, we'd be extinct in 17 days. So the situation is obviously at a breaking point. And as we continue to look at trajectories for population growth, obviously this is only going to put further pressures on food, energy, and water systems. So what are the main drivers of biodiversity? So there are 5. They're all interconnected. So tackling 1 or 2 won't resolve the problem. We really have to take a more holistic approach. And while we've mainly focused on climate change at the global scale, this has been, underwhelming, with targets being pushed out to 2050. And with nature, we don't have that luxury. We barely have till 2030 to reach a lot of these irreversible tipping points. So there are 2 things that really need to happen over the next 5 years if we want to tackle both of these challenges in tandem. And I think the main one is really to transform the food system. Reduce meat consumption by 50%, reduce methane emissions by 45%. If we look at electric vehicles, which we talk a lot about in aviation, and we look at the ag sector, it accounts for more emissions than all of transportation combined. So this is a must, and I don't think it gets largely enough attention to date. And I mean, it is rising on the agenda, thankfully, but still, I think it's something that needs to be on par with fossil fuel discussions, as it's a major driver of deforestation. So 50% of all of the habitable land is used for agriculture globally, and this accounts for 71% of tropical deforestation. However, forests, peatlands, and grasslands are a wonderful carbon sink. They absorb and store CO2. And so if we restore these ecosystems, it's the most effective solution we have to climate change after eliminating extractive fossil fuels. But the good news is, I had to give a little bit of a silver lining, is that it's not all too late. There is a narrow but a way forward that's emerging. And a lot of that really happened at COP15 in Montreal at the end of December in 2022, where we had this Paris Moment for Nature, where the global biodiversity framework was agreed. And really, I must say, businesses and investors have been leading the way here on this agenda. At least that's what I see from my vantage point as a large asset manager. we've been really pushing hard on getting companies to set targets to really understand their impacts and dependencies on nature and start to think about how they could secure their supply chains and really make sure that we're thinking about how do we safeguard returns over the long term. And if we don't really start tackling biodiversity risks and looking at the opportunities that the sector has, then we're not going to be in business. So here's just a bit of a snapshot of what was agreed. I think they're quite ambitious. Hopefully, we'll have a meeting coming up the end of this year in Colombia. So that will be COP16, where a lot of nations will be submitting their biodiversity plans and strategies. I think we only probably have a handful so far, 10 or 12, that have come out mainly from Europe. But I do believe that there'll be a huge number of countries submitting these plans in the coming months ahead. And so we need to have scrutiny that they actually are set to deliver against the targets that were agreed in Montreal. And there were 21 of them. And it will really transform every sector. Let me just try to jump ahead, which you can see here, which are the sectors that are most at risk. So it will primarily really obviously hit the ag sector. There have been some legislation coming out against deforestation in Europe, where any companies which are caught with any unsustainable supply chain or sourcing of palm, timber, coffee, paper, pulp, cocoa, and soy will have a 4% fine in their revenue if they're found to be non-compliant. So this is already having, huge impacts on global businesses already. And I do believe that also the producer countries, as well as the consumer countries, are really starting to now scramble with how they're going to comply with all of this. And then the other big area was around cutting subsidies. So that would count for about 15% of total agricultural value. So that will also be huge. And hopefully a lot of these will be reoriented towards positive incentives for those kind of moving to more regenerative and more sustainable agricultural methods, agroforestry, and the like. So you can see a little bit here, there's, a lot of sectors that are at high risk. Travel and tourism is another one. I think another area that hasn't gotten as much attention, but is also of high risk, is the construction sector. And so here in the UK, in February, so just a few months ago, the biodiversity net gain legislation was just approved, and that will require any new infrastructure or development project to have a net uplift of 10%. So they have to leave the habitats 10% better than where they found them. And so that will spur huge demand for biodiversity credits. So this whole market is really starting to take shape, and we see similar developments really beyond the UK. So I think it's an interesting model. Other countries are looking to adopt it. I think Ireland's already doing it now on a voluntary basis. Australia and New Zealand have their own with the Nature Repair Bill. And so I think we're starting to see a lot of different schemes emerging, which hopefully will learn from the failings of carbon markets, and to think about something that's even more complex as biodiversity, and how do we actually measure that? How can there be some kind of equivalence beyond different jurisdiction? Because, there's also many types of ecosystems even within one country, but can we come up with a global system that works, that's transparent, that's ensuring high levels of quality, transparency, additionality, and verifiability, and also co-benefits. How is this also benefiting local communities, Indigenous communities, the stakeholders who are custodians of the land as well. So I think it's still very early days to see what will happen with this market. It's something we're paying a close eye on. We actually launched earlier this year a fund called the Big Nature Impact Fund, which is a blended finance vehicle in partnership with DEFRA, which is the UK's Department of Environmental and Rural Affairs, to aim to protect and restore the UK and start to kind of build up this ecosystem and this concept of biodiversity net gain. And so we're looking at investing in nature-based solutions, whether it be wetlands, peatlands, coastal areas, and also other small businesses that we think are also providing the technology and the critical infrastructure to make this all happen. And then the EU is also looking at mandating that perhaps a certain proportion of removals will be mandated, and rather than just avoidance as part of their emission trading system. So that would also give, huge demand boost to all various offsetting schemes and conservation efforts. So a lot of this, I think, is very promising in terms of what might happen in the next couple of years, to see a lot of the negative trends that we're seeing turn for the positive, given all this business activity and investment actually finally flowing into these areas. And I think in terms of like what businesses should do, there's obviously huge risks. I think you can see on this slide alone, like the number of potential risks that businesses face for not tackling this. So it's not just about avoidance and understanding their impacts and dependencies on nature, but thinking about opportunities for how they can also turn this into a new revenue stream. So usually when we talk to the companies we're investing in that are exposed to those sectors that I mentioned, we ask them, to understand there's where their business activities are happening, how are they directly or indirectly impacting nature, what were those locations like before, try to establish a realistic baseline for what would be needed to be done to adequately restore them. How can they involve other stakeholders in this process? What other industry bodies, NGOs, local communities could they partner with to deliver on some nature positive goals? And right now we have the Task Force on Nature-related Disclosure. So much like we had on carbon 10 years ago, that's kicked off. Already 300 companies have committed to become early adopters and submit, their whole plan of how they're going to tackle nature. And I think this is just the beginning. So I think I'm hearing about new companies jumping on the bandwagon each day. And so part of that will be biodiversity credits in order to offset these activities, but a lot will also be on mitigation. What can they do to reduce, hazardous chemicals, reliance on plastics, also land use, degradation, soil erosion, etc. And then I think the next big area will be on adaptation. So how do we also use nature as a natural barrier to different disasters that we're facing as a result of climate change, looking at new bio-based materials. That's also a big growing area of focus for us as well. So maybe I'll end with just one last picture for all of you. And here we have a slide with the emperor penguins. And unfortunately, a colony last year failed to breed at levels never seen before due to total sea ice melting in Antarctica. And they think that 90% of the species will be quasi-extinct by the end of the species under the current trajectory, unless we start to do something differently. And here is some analysis of the satellite imagery showed that a lot of the ice had melted before and retreated before the babies had actually developed their waterproof feathers. So obviously this is not the legacy we want to leave. And this is just one example. I mean, we obviously all love the cute cuddly penguins and the more large and majestic creatures like penguins, but there's so many going extinct and disappearing before our very eyes that we can't even see, but we so depend on for everything and that we eat, breathe, our very existence. And so one plea that I wanted to leave all of you with is that we embed biodiversity in all conversations about nature, and all conversations about climate. And so a lot of times I feel that, we have the climate COP, we have the nature COP, we have discussions happening throughout these types of conferences, but we still fail to really intertwine the two, and we can't solve one without the other. So here's just a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that we're thinking about, that we're trying to do as investors and trying to drive more corporate activity on. Lots of regulation coming this way. So I think that will be a huge push for all of us. But really, the more and more we tie that together, I think the more and more we can make a dent on some of these very alarming figures that I started with.